My name is Adam, and I'm from the Stanford Navigation and Autonomous Vehicles Lab, and I'll be presenting my work on neural radiance maps for extraterrestrial navigation and path planning. So our work is focused on planetary rover navigation, and this is a challenging problem due to unknown and difficult terrain, as well as communication delays and signal blockage. And moving forward, there is a motivation for more autonomy for these vehicles in order to enable longer and more efficient autonomous driving, as well as scalability to multiple agent systems. And this is reflected in some upcoming missions from NASA. So Endurance is a mission concept to traverse thousands of kilometers across the lunar South Pole collecting samples, and it will require up to 10-hour intervals of autonomous driving due to the rover operating on the far side of the moon. Cadre is a mission to send 3 rovers to the moon in 2024 and demonstrate multi-agent autonomy. So a crucial step in rover autonomous navigation is path planning, and this is typically split up into 2 levels, global and local. Global path planning is done manually by scientists and rover drivers based on global information such as satellite imagery. And local planning is done on board the rover, and the rover estimates a local cost map of its surroundings based on onboard imagery, and then selects an arc to drive based on this information. Now, typically the local planner tries to track the global plan and stay as close to it as possible, but there are times where the global plan needs to be updated based on local observations. So here on the right is an example from the path taken by the Curiosity rover, where the initial global plan was actually routed in the direction of the blue arrow, but when the rover reached this location, it discovered some loose sand which made it difficult to traverse up this sloped terrain, and the scientists and rover drivers actually had to reroute the global plan in a different direction in order to continue progress. So note that this rerouting is currently done manually and over the course of many days. So in order to have these rovers operate autonomously over long periods of time, there is a need to integrate global and local information in real time together. Now, a significant challenge to this is that the rover is unable to both store and process all of the global information that is needed for this decision making that the rover drivers are currently using in order to do this process. Now, let's talk about the information sources that are available to us in this extraterrestrial setting. So there are 2 primary ones. The first is imagery, and the second are digital elevation models, or DEMS. So imagery is relatively easy to capture, and there are many sources such as orbiters, landers, and prime missions, but it is difficult to process and store images online, and also requires association with regions of interests. On the other hand, digital elevation models are typically constructed from laser altimetry, which is a different sensor modality, and these models encode the geometry of the terrain. So for any given point, it'll indicate the height at which that location is. However, DEMS are difficult to construct and update and are inherently discretized. So in this work, we use neural radiance fields, or NeRFs, as a novel representation for the map, and this representation combines both geometry and imagery, and it allows us to render arbitrary views of the scene, and only requires imagery to train, but can be augmented with depth information. So I'll go into more details on this in the later slides. So to summarize our contributions, first we develop a compact yet rich global map representation by fusing imagery through neural radiance fields. Next, we design a novel algorithm to effectively update the global plan based on local observations and this global map representation. And finally, we validate our approach with high-fidelity simulation. So as an outline for the rest of this talk, first I'll go over some background on neural radiance fields, as well as local and global path planning approaches. Next, I'll go into the details of our approach, talking about how we first construct a global map offline, then go into the online, local, and global path planning, as well as the local to global cost update. And then I'll finish with some simulation validation and results. So neural radiance fields, or NeRFs, are a neural network 3D scene representation, which was originally introduced for the task of novel view synthesis. So what this means is that given a set of training images with poses, I can then train a nerf from these images, and then this nerf network, once I have it, then I can give it a new target pose, and from that pose, synthesize a new image, potentially outside of the training data set, of what the scene looks like. So here, for example, if we have some rock, then we can take a bunch of images of it from different views, train a nerf, and then given a new view, synthesize a new image of that rock. So the way nerfs work and how they actually do this is that for a particular 3D point in viewing direction, the nerf then learns to predict what color and density the object or the scene would be at that particular point when viewed from that viewing direction. And so it's essentially the neural network takes as input this XYZ and viewing angle directions, and then outputs a RGB color and density value, which encodes sort of the occupancy of that space. And then given this architecture, then the way the nerf renders images is that each pixel in the image is reconstructed by shooting a ray out from the camera and then integrating these color and density values along sample points along the viewing ray. So now that we have some basic understanding of nerfs, let's talk a bit about local and global path planning. So we base our local path planning on AutoNav, which is a method that was developed and used for the Mars exploration rovers and currently even being used by the rovers currently on Mars. So the high-level idea is that the rover takes a pair of stereo RGB images, then extracts a depth map from the stereo images. The depth image is then projected onto 3D coordinates to obtain a point cloud, and then this point cloud is then gridded up in 2D space, and the points are the cells of this 2D grid are then assigned a traversability cost, which indicates the features of the terrain. So based on the slope and the roughness, we can then assign high cost, for example, to these rocks that we've observed here. Then once the cost map is constructed, the planner then selects from a candidate set of arcs, selects the optimal arc, which minimizes a weighted sum of 3 different costs: a steering cost, which just incentivizes driving straight, the traversability cost based on the cost map, as well as a waypoint cost, which incentivizes the local planner to drive towards the waypoint of the global plan. So for global path planning, the general approach is similar in terms of forming a global cost map and then running a search-based planning algorithm to generate a path as a sequence of waypoints. And the details of how to construct a global cost map can be found in many different references. The factors include terrain classification, slope and elevation, as well as rock density and regions of interest. And the specifics of doing global cost map initialization are outside of the scope of this work, where we are more interested in how to actually update this global cost map on the fly based on local observations. But for our purpose, we initialize the global cost map, and then we use A* to plan a global path through it. All right, so now I'll go into the details of our approach. So the first step of our approach is offline constructing a global nerf map of the operation region. So the first step of this process is to gather imagery of the global region. So since we're using simulation, we simulate a trajectory of a camera flying around at varying altitudes of around 10 to 200 meters. And then next, we estimate poses for all these images using standard techniques. And then finally, once we have these images and associated poses, we train a nerf map from the posed images as described in the previous background. Now, once we have the nerf map trained, we can then upload it to the rover, and specifically, we only need to upload a set of weights to the rover. And then online, the rover now has access to all of this information encoded in the nerf. And so online, the planning process is as follows. So first, the rover obtains local imagery from its cameras and then computes a local cost map as described in the local path planning background. Next, we perform a local to global cost update, which uses the nerf map to propagate these local costs to the global cost map. Then we perform global path planning. We replan our global path on the updated global cost map. And then finally, we use the updated global path as well as the local cost map that was just computed in order to plan a local path for the rover to actually execute. So now I'm going to go into more details on how we actually do this local to global cost update. So the idea of this is, given local cost observations, how can we update the global cost map accordingly? And we want to use the idea that visually similar regions should have similar cost. So we can use the NERF map as a global information source to assign costs based on regions of visual similarity. So what is depicted here is that here the rover sees a patch of rocks or a rock field which has and assigns it high cost from its local cost map computation. But from the global map, we actually see that this entire orange region here is sort of visually similar. However, we might not necessarily have known that it was high cost before, but now that we have locally observed it, that a portion of it is high cost, we can then update that entire region and assign it a higher cost, which will then greatly improve the quality of the planned paths. So in order to do this, we want to leverage the neural radiance map that we've trained of the global surroundings. And so specifically, within this map, we want to be able to associate similar patches of terrain. So for a given point in the global region, it's called X, we want to extract a set of features for that point, which describe the surrounding patch of terrain. And we call our features denoted as capital Phi. And we want to do it in such a way that visually similar patches of terrain will have similar features. So specifically what we do is, for this patch of terrain around X, we render a set of rays from the NERF from a top-down view. And for each ray, we accumulate the color and density values. And the color values are accumulated to a final color, whereas the density values, once the ray hits the surface of the terrain, then that accumulation is cut off and we can compute a depth value for that ray. Then once we have all of these accumulated color and depth values, referring to this diagram here on the right corner, then we concatenate all these values together into a single feature vector. And so this vector then forms our Phi of X feature. So we will use these features to then effectively update the global cost map based on local cost values. So once we have the features, we have all the tools we need to perform a global cost update, and we use interpolation in order to do this. So the first thing we do is parameterize the global cost function, call it C global of X. And we then will, given the local cost samples that we have from our cost map, we call all those points, the points in those samples, X of I. We gather the NERF features for all those points, being Phi of Xi. Now, then our goal is to fit C global from the associated local cost samples, Ci. And we do this using kernel ridge regression, which is a standard approach for regression over high-dimensional feature spaces. So specifically, we write down C global as a linear function of Phi of X, where the weights W are obtained by minimizing this objective here, which is a least squares objective plus a regularization term, which prevents overfitting in high-dimensional spaces. So on the right here is shown a visualization of the local cost samples, which are sparse and have a very limited range over only the local region. And on the right is shown the interpolated global cost function based on these local samples. So we can interpolate the cost that we get over a much larger global region. And the last step of this interpolation is that we actually want to limit the regions that we do interpolation with, as the effectiveness sort of decreases as we go farther away. And we do this using semantic clustering. So we render a top-down image of the entire global view, and then at initialization, we run semantic clustering in order to form clusters of the global region and only run interpolation within these clusters. All right, so now I will go into our simulation environment as well as our planning setup and the results. So we use Unreal Engine and AirSim, a combination of these two, in order to have a very high fidelity simulation. And specifically, we have this detailed moon landscape environment, which replicates or simulates the terrain that might be seen on the moon, with small varying sized rocks and large craters and sloped terrain. And AirSim allows us to simulate a vehicle on this terrain and gather onboard camera images and send it vehicle commands for control. And then we use Nerf Studio for all the training for nerfs and utilities. And within this environment, we specifically consider a 250 meter by 500 meter global region with the start and the goal shown here. And there is a high cost region highlighted in yellow, and we consider varying size rocks in our simulations in this region. Okay, so here is a video which shows our planning simulation in action, real-time visualization of vehicle in its environment, and on the right we can see in the global cost map that it is computing. So you see that the local cost map accordingly to actually reroute itself around this untraversable region and successfully reaches the goal. So here are some comparison results between our approach and a baseline approach which does not do this replanning and follows a fixed global plan. And so this is the first scenario we consider, where we have medium-sized rocks in this rock field. And so we see that our approach in 3 out of 3 runs successfully replans around the previously unseen high-cost region and navigates the rover to the goal, whereas the baseline approach does not update this global plan, and the local planner is unable, the obstacle is too large for the local planner to route through, and eventually the rover actually gets stuck in these medium-sized rocks. And the second scenario we consider were smaller rocks, which are traversable by the rover, but in a realistic scenario, you'd potentially be accumulating significant wear and tear on the rover by driving over these small sharp rocks, and so it would still be undesirable. And we see that our approach is still able to recognize the high cost from this region and replan itself around it, whereas the baseline drives the rover straight through. And we can quantify this by tracking the local cost that's accumulated over the entire stretch of this drive. And so we see that for the baseline, and these numbers are averaged over 3 runs each, the baseline approach accumulates while it does reach the goal faster, and with a shorter path, it accumulates a higher cost than our approach, which takes a little longer to safely route the rover around the high cost. So in conclusion, in this work, we utilize neural radiance fields, or NERFs, as a compact map representation for global information. And then we develop a planning framework which uses the NERF map to update global path planning based on local observations. All right, so thank you for listening, and for more NERF-related work from our lab at GNSS, please check out these 2 other presentations, more focused on using NERFs in the urban setting, one for vision-based localization, and the second presentation for GNSS non-line of sight prediction. All right, thank you.